Tech billionaire Julian Croft held the crumpled sketch between two fingers like a used napkin, his laugh rippling through the Silicon Valley boardroom as 20 investors joined in. A digital garage sale, he called it, tossing the papers back across the polished table. The black teenager who'd drawn it, 17-year-old Marcus Webb in a borrowed blazer, did not flinch. What nobody in that room knew, what the laughing men with their spreadsheets could not see, was that Marcus had been building the code in secret for 3 years in a cramped South Chicago apartment. 6 months later, that useless app had spread to 12 cities with zero marketing, and Julian Croft was dialing a number with shaking hands, ready to wire $50 million and praying Marcus would answer. His name is Marcus Webb. He built a community barter network from a broken laptop while his neighborhood was being left behind by the tech boom. He had no funding, no connections, no college degree, just a mathematical intuition that the billion-dollar algorithms couldn't match. The app he sketched on a paper napkin wasn't useless. It was a blueprint for a completely different internet, one that didn't ask for a credit score or a bank account. And the people who laughed didn't understand that the quietest ideas often change everything. This is how it happened. South Chicago is a place where the dollar doesn't circulate so much as it evaporates. In the Washington Heights neighborhood where Marcus Webb grew up, there were more payday loan storefronts than grocery stores. People traded things: a haircut for a cooked meal, a repaired transmission for a month of childcare. It was the underground economy that kept the streets alive, running on trust and memory and the intricate social math that banks never bothered to quantify. Marcus had been watching this hidden ledger since he was 9 years old, when his grandmother sent him to the corner store with a dozen eggs and instructions to come back with bread and milk. No money, just the eggs. The store owner, Mr. Okonkwo, knew the family owed a few dollars, but he also knew the eggs were fresh. They shook hands. The transaction was complete. Marcus never forgot it. That was the first time he saw barter as a system, messy, informal, but working. By age 14, he was teaching himself to code on a battered Dell laptop that his aunt had rescued from a recycling bin at the hospital where she cleaned offices. The screen flickered. The keyboard had 3 missing keys, but it ran Python. He downloaded every free resource he could find, staying up until 3 in the morning in the apartment on 91st Street. The glow of the screen the only light in a room he shared with his younger brother. He wasn't just learning syntax. He was translating the economic rhythms of his neighborhood into logic. How do you assign value to a cup of sugar when the price of sugar changes with the bus schedule? How do you build a reputation score without a credit history? The answer, he discovered, was a decentralized ledger that mapped local trust networks. It didn't require a bank, just a phone number and a neighbor willing to vouch for you. 3 years later, he had a working prototype he called SwapRoot. It had no slick design, no venture capital pitch deck, just code that worked. When a community organizer saw him demonstrating it at a block party, she put him in touch with a nonprofit accelerator that helped low-income youth founders. They gave him a slot at the Next Gen Tech Pitch event in San Francisco. The borrowed blazer he wore that day was from his uncle, a retired bus driver who had never even used a smartphone. Marcus walked into the glass-walled conference room with a printed sketch of his app and a USB drive containing the alpha build. Across the table, Julian Croft was already scrolling through his phone. Croft had founded $3 billion companies by then, all built on the premise that human behavior could be optimized into algorithms. He had no patience for small dreams. When Marcus introduced his community barter network, Croft held the sketch up, tilted his head, and laughed, a short, sharp sound like a glass snapping. "This isn't a business," he said. "It's a charity project without the charity." The room, full of men who had learned to follow his lead, erupted in chuckles. Marcus felt the heat rise in his neck, but he kept his voice steady. "With respect, sir, it's actually a platform that can onboard the unbanked." Croft cut him off. "Let me guess, you want to change the world. Save it for the college essay. We're here to make money." He tossed the sketch back onto the table. The presentation ended 60 seconds later. As Marcus walked out, one of the junior analysts, a young woman who hadn't laughed, slipped him a note. "The math in your algorithm is brilliant. Don't give up." He kept that note in his pocket for 6 months. But here's the thing about Julian Croft. He was right about one part. SwapRoot wasn't a traditional business. It was an organism. And it was already spreading through the informal trade networks of the South Side, then to Atlanta, then to Detroit, fueled by text messages and church bulletins, and the desperate need of communities that the banking system had abandoned. No one in Silicon Valley saw it coming, because they weren't looking in the right places. And when the analytics finally picked it up, the numbers would make Julian Croft's blood run cold. 6 months to the day after Julian Croft tossed Marcus Webb's sketch across the table, an analyst named Priya Mehta sat in a cubicle on the 42nd floor of Croft Global Ventures and watched a graph do something she had never seen before. The SwapRoot user base hadn't just grown, it had replicated itself across 12 separate metropolitan areas, each node sprouting new nodes without a single dollar in advertising. The organic download volume was 30,000 per day and accelerating. Transaction volume had crossed $4 million in active barters, all processed in local trade credits pegged to the US dollar, but floating on trust metrics that Priya couldn't fully reverse engineer. She ran the numbers 3 times before she allowed herself to believe them. Then she picked up her phone and called her boss. Julian Croft was in a meeting when the message arrived. The text was 4 words: "You need to see this." He walked out of the boardroom and went pale at the chart on Priya's screen. Marcus had not been idle. In the aftermath of the pitch humiliation, he had taken the bus back to South Chicago and sat in his bedroom for 2 straight days, the junior analyst's note tucked into the frame of his cracked monitor. Then he deleted every email related to the accelerator program, rolled back the unnecessary features the mentors had suggested, and rebuilt SwapRoot's core architecture to be lighter, faster, and completely independent of any centralized funding. He launched it quietly on a subreddit for local mutual aid networks and in the group chat of his grandmother's church. Within a week, a pastor in Birmingham had organized 300 families onto the platform. Within a month, a food cooperative in Detroit was processing its entire member exchange through the app. The ugly interface didn't matter because the people who needed it weren't judging pixels. They were trying to eat. Croft did not sleep that night. He stared at the acquisition data and felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years, the cold, vertiginous sensation of having miscalculated at scale. He had built Croft Global Ventures on the principle that value always consolidated toward assets that could be measured, priced, and owned. SwapRoot wasn't consolidating, it was distributing. It didn't hoard data, it federated it. And worst of all, it was growing inside a demographic that his entire portfolio had either ignored or exploited. The press would call it a miss. The board would call it negligence. He canceled his morning meetings, locked his office door, and began drafting a contingency offer with terms so aggressive his own legal team would try to talk him down. But on the other side of the country, Marcus was ignoring his phone. The device had been buzzing nonstop for 2 weeks. Unknown numbers, Silicon Valley area codes, venture firms that had sent rejection letters after the pitch now sending partnership inquiries with exclamation points. One of them offered $2 million sight unseen. Marcus deleted it without opening the attachment. His older brother, Terrence, who had dropped out of community college to work at a shipping warehouse, watched him from the kitchen doorway. "You're not gonna answer?" he asked. Marcus didn't look up from his screen. They laughed, not just at my idea, at the idea that someone from here could build something they didn't. "I'm not giving them the chance to do it again." He paused. "They'll have to come to me now." And that's exactly what happened, except it wasn't a venture partner who made the first real move. It was a 19-year-old coder from Oakland named Jasmine Okonkwo, the granddaughter of the corner store owner from Marcus's childhood block. She had been an early adopter of SwapRoot, and she had quietly forked the code into a microlending module that allowed users to collateralize their barter history for small cash loans. She posted the pull request on the project's GitHub at 3 in the morning with a note that read, My grandfather always knew who was good for it. Now the app does too. Within a week, the module had been integrated, and SwapRoot became not just a barter network but a shadow banking layer that operated outside every regulatory parameter the financial industry had spent a century constructing. When Croft learned about the microlending fork, he didn't just go pale, he felt the floor shift. The platform wasn't just a cute community tool anymore. It was a distributed financial protocol, and it had crossed the line from niche to existential threat. If the wrong people, or the right ones, recognized what SwapRoot could do to the payday lending industry, the remittance corridors, the credit scoring monopolies, the entire architecture of consumer finance could be rewired from the bottom up. Croft's current portfolio held a 40% stake in 3 different credit analytics firms. He was in the business of counting who was worth the risk. Marcus Webb had built something that made that question irrelevant. The first call came at 7 in the morning. It went to voicemail. The second came at 7:12. Then texts. Then an email from Croft's executive assistant, the same one who had ushered Marcus out of that glass-walled room, containing a formal letter of interest and a non-disclosure agreement. Marcus read the email, forwarded it to his newly retained pro bono attorney, a fiery civil rights lawyer from Chicago named Anita Collier who had heard about SwapRoot through a tenant union organizer, and then walked to the kitchen to pour himself a bowl of cereal. He did not reply. But then a third party entered the equation, one that even Croft hadn't anticipated. The federal government had noticed. Not the Commerce Department or the SBA, the Office of the Controller of the Currency. A routine sweep of unregistered fintech platforms had flagged SwapRoot's microlending module as potentially operating outside of consumer protection laws. Marcus received a letter requesting a voluntary compliance meeting. He had no legal team, no policy experience, and no warning that the system he'd built to circumvent predatory institutions was now being framed as a potential violation of the very rules those institutions had written. And that's when the phone rang with a number Marcus recognized, Julian Croft's direct line. The man who had mocked him in front of 20 investors was calling to say he could make the OCC letter disappear, but only if Marcus sat down and talked terms. The message was clear and unsubtle. The same man who'd laughed at a teenager now wanted to position himself as the gatekeeper between Marcus and the destruction of everything he'd built. Marcus picked up his phone, stared at the incoming call, and let it ring one more time. Then he answered. The voice on the other end was smooth, the same voice that had filled a glass-walled boardroom with laughter 6 months earlier. But now Julian Croft wasn't laughing. He spoke quickly, as if the words had been stacked behind his teeth waiting for release. Marcus, I won't waste your time. That letter from the OCC, it can disappear. I have relationships in every regulatory body that matters. You're building something remarkable, but you're also building it in a legal gray area that could destroy you before you see your first seed round. I want to help. I can make this go away and give you the institutional backing to scale globally. Name your percentage. I'm ready to wire $50 million to make this right. He paused, and the careful performance of generosity was undercut by the tremor in his voice. Not emotion, just the friction of a man unused to asking. Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at the cracked linoleum floor. You laughed at me, Mr. Croft. You called my idea a useless digital garage sale in front of a room full of people. Now you want to invest. There was silence. Then Croft said quietly, I misjudged you. I'm not the first man to make that mistake. I'm offering you a way out of this mess and a path to the top. 48 hours. That's all I'm giving you before the OCC moves to formal action. After that, there's no deal, just lawyers. He hung up before Marcus could respond. Marcus called Anita Collier before he called anyone else. She was a woman who had spent 2 decades suing banks for redlining and predatory lending, and she knew the regulatory landscape better than the regulators themselves. When she heard the details of Croft's offer, she went quiet for a full 10 seconds. I don't like it, she said. A billionaire who smells a threat doesn't offer $50 million out of goodwill. He's buying something. Give me a few hours. She worked through the night, pulling the origination documents on the OCC complaint through a contact in the Treasury Department. What she found rewrote the entire story. The initial flag on SwapRoot hadn't come from a routine sweep. It had been triggered by a formal complaint filed by a think tank called the Center for Market Integrity, a nonprofit funded almost entirely by a foundation controlled by Croft Global Ventures. The same man offering to save Marcus from regulatory ruin had lit the fire himself. But it got worse. The Center for Market Integrity had filed its complaint 3 weeks before the OCC letter arrived, meaning Croft had launched this attack while he was still trying to get Marcus on the phone. Anita traced the funding chain further and found that Croft's foundation had also funneled money into a lobbying group that was currently drafting legislation to classify decentralized barter networks as unlicensed money transmission businesses. If passed, the bill would make SwapRoot illegal in 42 states. Croft wasn't just trying to buy the app. He was trying to build a cage around the entire category and strangle it before it could threaten his portfolio's central assets: 3 payday lending chains, 2 credit scoring platforms, and a remittance processor that charged migrant workers 14% to send money home. Marcus's invention was a direct assault on each of those profit models, and Croft had decided it would not survive. Priya Mehta sat at her terminal on the 42nd floor, watching the encrypted files her boss thought he had hidden behind corporate firewalls. She had been the one to flag SwapRoot's growth, but she had also been the one who watched Croft walk back from that first meeting 6 months ago and tell a vice president that the black kid with the broken laptop would wash out in a year. Now she was staring at internal strategy memos that detailed the entire operation: the think tank complaint, the drafted legislation, a contingency plan to buy SwapRoot and strip it for patents before shutting it down entirely in 18 months. The documents were marked confidential, but Priya was the daughter of immigrants who had fled a regime that used records to crush dissent. She knew what silence cost. She copied the files onto a clean drive, sealed it in a small envelope, and walked out of the building at lunch without a word. She didn't go home. She went to the post office and mailed it to the address she had found in an old registration filing for SwapRoot, a P.O. box on 91st Street in Chicago. While Croft's net tightened, another force was gathering. Jasmine Okonkwo's microlending module had been noticed by a coalition of community development credit unions that had spent decades trying to serve the unbanked with interest rates that didn't break families. Their executive director, a 68-year-old woman named Dorothy Chen, had watched the OCC letter story break on a fintech newsletter and immediately recognized an opportunity. She called Marcus directly through a mutual connection at a Chicago housing nonprofit. "We've been trying to build something like this for 10 years, she told him, "but we've been stuck inside the regulatory box. You built outside it, and now they're trying to shove you into a box of their own making. We can offer you something Croft never will: an existing licensing umbrella. As a service provider to federally insured credit unions, SwapRoot can operate legally under our charter with consumer protections already in place. We're not offering $50 million. We're offering legitimacy, ownership, and a board seat for every low-income community you serve." Marcus listened, and the tightness in his chest loosened for the first time in weeks. He told Dorothy he'd have an answer within 72 hours. The public had begun to notice. A journalist at a Chicago nonprofit news outlet published a long-form piece titled, "The app they laughed at is now eating their lunch," and it went viral across every social platform, where people were tired of Silicon Valley's contempt for flyover country. The hashtag #LetSwapRootGrow trended for 2 straight days. Footage surfaced from the original pitch event. Someone had recorded it on a phone, and the clip of Croft's laughter, the tossed papers, the dismissive head tilt, looped across millions of screens. The comments were merciless. In the corporate offices of Croft Global Ventures, the PR team was in crisis mode, but Croft refused to issue a statement. He just kept calling Marcus's phone, which now went straight to voicemail. The day before Croft's 48-hour deadline expired, Priya Mehta's envelope arrived at Anita Collier's office. The lawyer opened it, scanned the documents, and then leaned back in her chair and laughed, not with relief but with the cold satisfaction of a person holding a match above a powder keg. She called Marcus. "You need to see this. Croft didn't just make a mistake. He documented his entire conspiracy. Every email, every funding transfer, every contingency plan. This is evidence of premeditated market manipulation and regulatory fraud. It's not just a lawsuit, it's a federal case." Marcus sat on his bed in the apartment on 91st Street and stared at the scanned pages on his phone. Quietly, he said, "I want him to come here, to Chicago. I want to look him in the eye one more time, but this time he's standing in my house, not the other way around." 3 days later, Julian Croft's private jet touched down at Midway Airport. He had been summoned not to a corporate law office or a neutral conference room, but to the gymnasium of the South Chicago Community Center on a hot Thursday afternoon. The room smelled of floor wax and old basketballs. Folding chairs had been set out for a crowd of about 200 people, neighbors, journalists, credit union representatives, and a dozen teenagers from the same block party where Marcus had first demoed SwapRoot. At the front, a microphone waited on a metal stand. Croft walked in flanked by two lawyers, his suit a dark slash against the fluorescent lights, and took a seat in the front row. He looked like a man walking into a courtroom where the jury had already been selected against him. Marcus stood at the back of the room, wearing a simple black hoodie, the same USB drive from Priya's envelope tucked in his pocket. He walked to the microphone, tapped it twice, and looked across the folding chairs at the billionaire who had once laughed at his idea. The room went silent. Then Marcus Webb began to speak, and the entire architecture of power in the room shifted before he said a single word. Marcus did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He began by thanking the people in the room, the neighbors who had traded eggs and sugar and trust long before any app existed, the credit union leaders who had believed in him, the journalists who had chased the truth. Then he turned to Julian Croft, who was sitting very still in his tailored suit, the fluorescent light pooling on his polished shoes. "You told me in that boardroom that my idea was a charity project without the charity, that it wasn't a business. You were right. It's not a business. It's infrastructure. It's the street-level economy you've spent your career strip mining for data and fees." He held up the USB drive. "And this contains every internal memo, every funding transfer, every plan you and your foundation made to bury my community's work under a regulatory avalanche so you could buy the pieces for pennies and shut it down. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to let you watch what happens when the people you underestimated finally get a seat at the table." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the back. Croft opened his mouth, but no sound came. His lawyers shifted, but Marcus raised a hand. "You don't need to speak. You already spoke 6 months ago." He turned to Dorothy Chen, sitting in the second row with a folder of partnership documents. "The Credit Union Coalition has offered SwapRoot a permanent home under a federal charter with full regulatory compliance and community governance. We're not taking $50 million in venture capital. We're taking zero. We don't need Croft Global Ventures. We never did. The only thing we needed was for the gatekeepers to get out of the way." At that moment, Priya Mehta stood up from the back row, where she had been sitting quietly in a plain gray sweater. She walked to the front and stood beside Marcus. "I worked for Julian Croft," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of risk. "I brought the documents, but I'm not here as a whistleblower. I'm here because I want to work on something that actually solves the problem instead of profiting from it. If you'll have me." The crowd erupted. 200 people on their feet, clapping not for victory over an enemy but for the visible shift of power from a closed boardroom to an open community hall. Croft left without a word 20 minutes later, his face ashen, his lawyers trailing behind him like forgotten afterthoughts. The video of Marcus's speech went online that night and amassed 8 million views within 24 hours. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency issued a statement 2 days later, clarifying that the complaint against SwapRoot had been reviewed and dismissed, and that its own internal process was being audited for improper influence. The Center for Market Integrity lost its funding. The lobbying bill to classify barter networks as money transmission died in committee. And Julian Croft resigned as CEO of Croft Global Ventures 3 weeks after that afternoon in the South Chicago gymnasium, stating personal reasons in a terse press release that no one believed. But the real payoff wasn't the billionaire's fall. It was what happened in the months that followed. SwapRoot, now partnered with a network of 47 credit unions across the country, processed over $60 million in barter and microlending transactions in its first year under the new model. Default rates on the microloans sat at less than 2%, a fraction of the industry average, because the algorithm Marcus had built wasn't predicting credit scores. It was reading trust graphs, and trust, it turned out, was a harder currency than debt. Jasmine Okonkwo, the teenager who forked the lending module, was given a full scholarship to study computer science and a job waiting for her as a lead engineer. And Priya Mehta became SwapRoot's chief data officer, building the analytics dashboard she had once used to spy on the company's growth into a tool that credit unions could use to map financial deserts and deploy resources with surgical precision. There was one final detail that the dinner table tellings of this story often leave out. In the chaos of the community center confrontation, after Croft had walked out and the crowd had swelled around Marcus, a small, folded note was pressed into his hand by a man who didn't give his name. Marcus unfolded it later that night in his apartment. It was the original sketch he had printed for the pitch, the one Croft had tossed back across the table, now creased and worn. And scrawled in the corner in handwriting he didn't recognize were the words, "The quietest ideas change everything." He didn't know who had written it, maybe the same analyst who had slipped him the encouragement note 6 months earlier, maybe someone else entirely. He pinned it to the wall above his monitor, next to the old photograph of his grandmother. He left it there as he began the next version of SwapRoot, the one that would go global. And the room, once again, was listening. Somewhere right now, there's a kid in a cramped apartment with a cracked laptop and an idea that the people in charge have already decided is too small, too strange, too inconvenient to take seriously. Maybe they've been laughed at. Maybe they've been told to wait their turn to get a degree to learn their place. Marcus Webb didn't wait. He built a financial infrastructure on a handshake system that had existed in his neighborhood for generations, and he refused to hand it over to the same men who'd mocked it. The quietest ideas really do change everything, not because they're loud, but because they're rooted in something real that the algorithms can't see. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What's the idea you've been sitting on, the one someone laughed at or ignored that the world might actually need? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved something in you, send it to one person who needs to hear it right now. If you're not subscribed yet, stay close. There's another story coming next week that I honestly cannot wait to tell you. Until then, may the right doors open, may the gatekeepers step aside, and may the truth always find the right room.